Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com and the Big Four Accounting Firms YouTube channel. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everybody to support us if you have a chance or if you can. Even $1 helps, and we have a link in the description to a website called Buy Me a Coffee. It's just a way to donate to us and support us. Again, any amount is helpful so that we can keep putting out content. And there's also other ways for you to support us in the show notes to this podcast or on YouTube in the description. In today's podcast, we're going to be once again talking about ESG standards and increasing regulation, but also increasing and decreasing interest in these ESG reporting standards. And we're also going to be talking about some other news about Deloitte later on. But first off, we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff regarding ESG. So first, we're going to talk about the SEC. Now, the SEC has created a task force to identify misconduct in environmental, social, and governance reporting, which is very interesting that the SEC has already established this. But they say this is because, they say this for multiple reasons, and I'll be going over this again and again, but they say this is because the Biden administration in the United States is focused on combating climate change, as evidenced by them rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. And the administration will also utilize the Office of the Whistleblower to help combat fraud. The SEC will be using that. So what the SEC is going to do is they're going to, take whistleblower tips to help fight this ESG fraud. But I'm not sure this is going to have much bite to it, because even if you do a whistleblower complaint for a regular SEC financial complaint, it takes them forever to investigate, multiple years, unless it's extremely significant with rock solid evidence. So I'm not sure that this is anything for companies to actually be afraid of, unless they're way overstating their ESG impact. And any whistleblower complaint is not going to be taken that seriously, in my opinion, and based on my experience and knowledge of this area. It's just going to take forever. As you know, I talk about bureaucracy on here a lot, not only in the Big Four, but in the government and the SEC and just regulators around the world. As we've seen, they've tried to regulate accounting firms and global markets, and they just can't prevent everything that they say they're going to prevent. Companies still go under, companies still commit fraud. So they're just trying to put a little bit of fear out here, but I don't think this thing will have much teeth. And the SEC also said they're doing this as a result of some news that came out of the Global ESG Monitor. I didn't even know there was a Global ESG Monitor, but apparently there is. And the Global ESG Monitor says that U.S. companies and the Dow Jones earned miserable scores in reporting their progress towards ESG goals. And the SEC says they also did this because the growth and popularity of ESG funds. And that makes more sense to me, because the SEC regulates capital markets, and these ESG funds, these passive index funds, are becoming more popular. And to go on, I'm going to reference another report. The SEC and Global ESG Monitor are correct that the ESG is not a priority in the United States. According to a survey from PwC, ESG reporting is sixth on CFO's list of priorities for their finance function. Number 1 is establishing the finance function as a strategic business partner. Number 2 is increasing automation. And number 3 is cost management. ESG reporting comes in 6 for priorities for CFOs. And maybe this was the wrong question to ask CFOs. They should have asked the CEO or maybe the head of HR. But sure enough, these CFOs are going to get slammed over the head with this ESG stuff. So they better start putting it as a priority, or people are going to start coming after them for not being social justice enough. But of course, if you're a CFO and you're in charge of the finance function, you're in charge of the company's money and finances. So you're worried about getting the money places where it needs to be. And that's basically number 1 on their priorities. Strategic business partner. Number 2 is automation. We've seen that with Deloitte and their artificial intelligence and them creating that function to help automate the finance function. In cost management, number 3, that makes sense as a CFO because, again, you're in charge of the company's finances. You're not in charge of social justice for your company. You're in charge of the finances. So until the CEOs and regulators slam ESG over the head of these companies, the CFOs are still going to only be concerned with managing the company's finances. And moving on from that, we're going to talk about another ESG article that came out. And this article says, and it's on multiple places, Bloomberg, Zero Hedge, other places, that ESG investors are also souring on the idea of ESG in corporate America. And the person they're referencing is Jeff Ubben, who previously praised companies like BlackRock for ESG investing. They're now growing skeptical. Ubben is now saying that BlackRock's ESG investments will not address climate change. And Jeff Ubben is an ESG-minded investor. He's an activist investor and recently joined the board of ExxonMobil. And he said that BlackRock's passive investments won't reward carbon-intensive companies that are reducing emissions. So basically like oil and gas companies that are really trying to reduce their emissions. And if you look at these investments, these funds hold traditional investments like regular oil and gas companies and big tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon. So these passive investment funds more closely mirror regular S&P 500 funds and other things like that. It doesn't really reward ESG. Companies making ESG cuts. It's just these tech companies or these oil and gas companies. There's no really designation on ones that are significantly reducing their carbon footprint. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. And as you see, like ESG is all over the news. That's why I keep going over it. It's the way the accounting firms are going to make more money as more governmental regulation comes in. The SEC has increased their regulation over ESG now. They have a specific task force. So only more and more is going to come out of this. And this is going to be more issues for the accounting firms because even they're not fully aware of everything ESG. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. And along these same lines, I wanted to discuss some news regarding Deloitte. According to a website, innovationoz.com, which is regarding Australia, Deloitte's government work in Australia grew by 35%, and their revenue grew from 156 million to 214 million in the past year. And the biggest contracts came from Services Australia and the Digital Transformation Agency within Australia. And this news comes on the heels of Deloitte building a government AI institute in the United States. And the reason they're doing this is because as governments exercise more power over people and public health during this pandemic time, you can expect Big Four revenues to grow from government. That's why they're building all these government services, is because government's reach over people is growing. So I only see this area of the Big Four's revenue growing because you have to think of everything the governments are doing, especially in the United States. The government spending is the highest it's ever been. There's bills that are passing that are trillions of dollars, and it seems like they're passing each month. And these bills are things that need to be handled quickly, like the unemployment issues in the United States. And Deloitte's won a lot of that work. Vaccine management, we've seen the Big Four win that there. Other public health legislation is also passed. KPMG is getting involved in helping governments get therapeutics to people. So it's public health in the government. It's a result of these lockdowns, things that come out of that, such as unemployment, getting these stimulus checks, managing these huge projects that the governments are passing. And if you're not getting involved with the government right now, then you're missing on trillions and trillions of dollars. Because what other area of the economy right now is just growing by trillions and trillions? There's not one that you can say. There's companies that are growing big, but things like Amazon, the total market cap of Amazon is a couple trillion. and other big companies are a trillion or billions. They're not using $4 trillion at a time. They're not passing bills of $4 trillion. These companies aren't spending trillions of dollars in a year, but the governments around the world are. So this is a big area of growth for the big four accounting firms. So that's the podcast for today. To stay up to date, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. And if you can, support us financially through the Buy Me a Coffee donation link in the show notes to this podcast. And if you can't do that, then make sure to check out our YouTube channel, Big Four Accounting Firms, and subscribe there. Thanks for listening.